Hello, everybody. Welcome. Because we are trained by language and culture to think as if intelligence is a possession. This is a misuse of the container metaphor. Even though there are examples of intelligence localized as the body, history, memory, and behavior action of what we could think of as distinct individuals. The ballet dancer, the classical musician, the neurosurgeon, the elite coder, the mother who expertly cares for 4 or more children, the orator who is certainly appearing as an individual performer, the comedian. There are veritable examples of the existence and enaction of individual intelligences and profound skillfulness, which is where I'm going to go toward in this walk and talk today. But I'm pretty sure that none of them none that I'm aware of arise or exist in absolute isolation. And the arising part is the important part here. Not for all of us, but for most of us, our capacity to experience, embody, exemplify, and enact the vast library of our possible intelligences will profoundly depend on the contexts in which we arise, in which we mature, quote unquote. And our intelligences are composed with and for and against those with whom we imagine ourselves. And certainly we have actual local relationships, family, peers, culture, media, so forth. But even those must be imagined, right? We have to imagine participating in them. To participate in them, there's a powerful necessity for organized, coherent consciousness in relation with the world, history, mystery, possibility, potential. The Stellar's Jay recognizes me, and I brought him, it's a male, pretty sure, a peanut. And having received peanuts before, it has an imaginal trace in its memory. This is very strange. What the hell could that even mean? Someone's bag. So it's almost like a trap for humans, right? Put a bag with a bunch of objects in it and just leave it on a bench and then walk away from it and see what happens. Because the humans are naturally curious about the contents of the bag. No one knows what might be in there. A few weeks ago, in a garden around the corner from my house, the gardeners found $50,000, stacks of $100 bills in a bag. Apparently, the money was filthy, really gross, but still, cash dollars, you can wash them. I didn't feel, I had complex feelings about that, and we'll come back to the other topics, but imagine finding that yourself and then taking it home, right? And wondering, is this money perhaps cursed? Why is it so disgustingly filthy? Who could have disposed of it in this way, and why did they do so? Right? And is it a trap? Because it's a perfect kind of trap. When my father used to work in the Weberstown Mall in Stockton at Rogers Jewelers, him and the other salespeople, they would often crazy glue a silver dollar to the tile in front of the store for entertainment. And they would watch as women kicked it and broke their heels, and people tried to pry it off the floor, and they thought this was hilarious. But it's not unfunny. The problem is rather that it's a cruel kind of humor that depends on deceiving others and then finding their vulnerability to deception entertaining. It's a very mean-spirited mode of the possibilities of humor, and many of the possibilities of humor have degraded into such meanly spirited modes in our time. My friend who lives in town here, Johnny Tio Calderon, posted something on Facebook yesterday that I found absolutely hilarious, and I still find it hilarious. But there's nothing mean about it. He wrote, "Some people have the calm before the storm. I have the panic before the nothing." And a couple of my friends said that I think that's a generational thing. And I said, yeah, maybe. He often writes very humorous things, but I thought that was hilarious. Mostly because it's so familiar to my own direct experience of having a mind and consciousness. And part of having a mind and consciousness is imagining futures. And I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by intelligence, because this concept is fundamental for me. It is orienting, and that's what makes it fundamental. If I want anything, there's probably a few things I want. I want to avoid making the most deadly mistakes that can be made during an incarnation. The ones that really screw futures up and maybe hurt other beings. I want to see better every time I begin to see. I want purposes that improve themselves each time I arouse them. I want more intelligence, which means insight, awareness, seeing from above, and often seeing for purposes and in ways that are extremely uncommon among my species, because we are trained to the lowest rungs of the ladders. On which we might, hopefully together with and for each other, ascend toward the finest or most beautiful, most profound, most trustworthy, most holy potentials of our humanity and animality and beingness and origin. And that ascent is crucially important to me. The relatively malignant gains that are imported into consciousness as we learn English in childhood and as we become enculturated, particularly courtroom mind, possession mind, war mind, and drag us down the ladder mind. Meaning, like, let's go for even lower hanging fruit until we get to the rotten, moldy stuff on the ground, and, maybe we'll be able to find an even more deleterious place from there, right? There's no end to the low end of the ladders. Much like the high end, they are infinite, but they're far more easily accessed than what I'm positing as up on the ladders of memory, insight, intelligence, awareness, human and cultural possibility. So, what do I actually mean by intelligence? And here's the real problem, or here's a real problem. Speaking abstractly about virtues is ironically almost the opposite of enacting them much of the time, if not most of the time. One has to be profoundly skillful to enact something while speaking of it. I have occasionally seen recent examples of this. I saw a few examples in the not modestly insane locutions of Ammon Hillman in his recent interview with Danny Jones. There were some examples in there. I've seen other examples in the locutions of John Vervaeke recently, who I've managed to fascinate my son with, which is a pretty significant accomplishment for me, since nearly nothing that I can present to my progeny actually captivates his attention. Mostly he attacks it, which, is a perennial problem. So this is the problem, right? I can talk about what I mean by intelligence, but if I'm not enacting it while speaking about it, then I'm walking away from it by talking about it. And this is a very complex and difficult problem to resolve. Actual prodigy tends to be able to resolve this problem without much planning in the natural course of not merely locution, but a word I recently came to understand the meaning of, if I understand the meaning of it, elocution, which I'm going to pretend means to accomplish what is being spoken of by speaking about it. Now, I can think of two contrary examples, which will be familiar to some of those who've listened to my recent podcasts. One that is the opposite of elocution, which is a statement something like, actually there's a couple of them. One of my favorites is just to demonstrate the capacity for incredibly absurd idiocy in language. One of the statements is, "This is the most important statement you will ever hear." It's kind of my version of the Russellian paradox, if I understand which paradox that is correctly. A similar anti-illocutive statement is, "I will not be speaking to you today about leverage or succession." And an example, if I understand the concept correctly. Now, I've long understood a similar concept that may not be truly elocution, but it is the capacity to accomplish certain kinds of virtues, mostly perspectival, intellectual, conceptual, to accomplish them by framing them in language. And also to do what is being said by saying it. Which is very, very different from mere description. So if I say that a manifold is a bubble of many bubbles, and there are intersections between these bubbles, and that what I'm doing right now to form this sentence is collapsing a manifold, right? I'm throwing away bubbles until I get a kind of a complex stick figure from the remaining intersections. And then I select among those for the structure of the sentences I will vocalize. And it is similar in thought or problem solving. So, what do I mean by intelligence? Well, One of the best examples is the entire array of non-human, non-representational intelligences embodied in the biorelational hyperstructure that we refer to as nature. And particularly the bubble of life that surrounds and penetrates and enlivens our planet here. Those beings are not referring to things. They are enacting anciently sophisticated biorelational intelligences, moment to moment, instant to instant, together as a unity seemingly comprised of individuals. So, one of my jokes recently was the problem with the idea of non-human intelligences is that it's very likely that that's the only kind there is. Obviously, our species, at the species level, is profoundly adept at certain terrifying modes of techne, and as profoundly bereft of the wisdom necessary to know which of them to not implement and how to not implement examples that are omnicidal. On the other hand, our collective techne is like a demon, very profound. I was talking with my friend Eric the other night, and I was recalling when I was a child, it was as if I had lived before in other ages, and could thus recall what in science fiction or the game Traveler or other sci-fi systems could recall the tech level of the civilization in which I previously existed, and compared that to what I discovered in this incarnation with objects like toasters and televisions and watches and, hems. And think about how complex a hem is. Maybe you could figure out how to sew somewhat crudely, perhaps using the viscera of animals as a thread and animal skins as fabric. But your chances of composing an actual fabric, very slim. The simple cotton sheet underneath my bed is a catastrophically sophisticated example of human techne. And zippers are ridiculously, complexly advanced and useful. So there's this whole dimension of techne at the collective level of the humans that really does provide us with what we can imagine as benefits, reasonably imagine as benefits. Comfort, convenience, survivability. That second word is one of the most dangerous of the demons. Apparently the humans have no inhibitive intelligence around what not to trade for convenience, including our ancestors, our souls, our origin, our intelligence, our health, our planet itself, the anciently conserved ecologies, you name it. We will gladly or, stupidly hand all that over. Our privacy, our relationships, there's nothing safe. But the reason that we will hand it over isn't necessarily that we're just stupid or addicted. It's that we're lonely. We're isolated. And the specter of the anti-cultures that arise in the wake of the human relationship with technique is recursively self-impoverishing. Right? It just creates new and greater depths of impoverishment within us and in the world over time. And the pain of that is what makes us willing to trade away the most precious assets imaginable. Assets so precious that their value is impossible to comprehend, which also makes it easy. Right? Something that's infinite, something that appears infinite to consciousness, one cannot understand that it has been traded away. It seems impossible to imagine that it could be taken away or fracked for profit, power. So it's very challenging to abstractly say what I mean by intelligence. And since I hadn't practiced it, and I'm really just improvising here, I'm not too sure of my footing, so to speak. But I'll try to say some things about it. It is the capacity to usefully improve previously practiced methods, ideas, perspectives, what we call solutions, which is a very strange thing to call them. The capacity to resolve various conflicts and or problems, and also the capacity, particularly, to detect and attend the repercussions of such solutions so as to avoid the self-ironizing weaponization that rather naturally occurs if the intelligences we practice and develop are not broadly progenerative of insight rather than mere technique. So it's the capacity to rise above the common, often lethal, meaning causative of forgetting, results of poorly conceived purposes, motivations, ideologies, conceptions. Now, of course, actual insight is not formally above. It's not necessarily up from the other dangerous stuff. Yeah. This is a metaphor. I think we all understand in a basic way what the metaphor implies. And the simplest way to say that is just improvement. Now, there are many spiritual traditions that naturally and perhaps intelligently warn us about the dangers of conceiving the purpose of improvement. And this is in part because conceiving that purpose is distracting. We are inclined to become unpresent, to defect from intimate awareness of the moment, our bodies, situations, relationships, histories. And this desire drives much of the problem with human techne. But it is truly astonishing what the humans can accomplish with their superorganism-like technical behavior. Unfortunately, most of that stuff is quite malignant in its inaction. Results. There's a beehive about 15 feet from me. It's an intentional beehive. Some human put it together and populated it and so forth. I'm going to take a closer look for a moment. I'm a huge fan of the Hymenoptera. If I understand correctly, the Greek origins of this word hymen, which we refer in English and maybe other languages to a sheath in the reproductive organs of the female that must be broken for effective intercourse to occur. I think the word means blood. It just means blood. But this is what I derived from listening to Ammon Hillman. However, it's also strongly associated with femininity, or the female gender. And so clearly Hymenoptera, which is the genus? I can't remember which Linnaean ladder segment is right, of the ants, bees, wasps, termites, because they are female-dominated, biologically female-dominated societies. Or at least that's the impression we take from our own purposeful derivations. So one reasonable definition of intelligence is to just see better, to continually to forge a cascade of greater insight that with each iteration gets a richer, deeper, broader, and more specific array of capacities to derive useful conceptions and potentials for action, behavior, relation. Well, surely you can see how different this description is from the inaction of it. And for that, for the moment, I must simply apologize. I'm not as sharp as I could be surrounded by intelligent others, or with the participation of intelligences far richer and older than my own. But another definition of intelligence that's very valuable is one associated with the oath that we associate with Hippocrates. And I strongly suspect that in the Greek there's a strong distinction between Hippocrates and the root from which we get the concept of hypocrisy, which is the ironic violation of espoused principles, intelligences, or perspectives by one's actions. And speech is an action, too, even though it's a very specific kind of action. But the Hippocratic Oath includes the admonition to first don't make things worse. And this is part of the admonition in Buddhist and other spiritual systems to not try to improve situations or things. Let them be as they are. Attend your own, attention. Attend your own attention, body, perceptions. Don't place too much urgency on thoughts. Let them dissolve away just as they arise. Try not to enact them or cause them to become recursively self-generative of long sequences of thoughts, which, by the way, goes back to that hilarious thing that my friend Johnny said. Because to have the panic before the nothing is the result of too much thinking, right? And I guess, intelligence can also be understood as concerned with three primary features of human attentional investment, which are ambiguity, vigilance, and prediction. So when something's ambiguous, we're going to tend to pay more attention to it unless it's irresolvable. We're going to try to collapse it toward a graspable derivative, right? And that's costly in terms of attention and straight-up metabolism. Like glucose, whatever feeds cognitive and nervous system activity, because you have to stay in a state of readiness, which is expensive. So what the humans like to do, and what they often do, and what many of their ideas of convenience orbit, is the reduction in ambiguity over time, right, as an equation. and the attempt to produce something like negative ambiguity, which is something that gravitically pre-resolves possible future ambiguities moment to moment. And that's why we live in boxes that are dead inside. Because when they're dead inside, there's nothing to attend. The degree of unexpected arisal of ambiguity is extremely low inside a house. There's nothing is moving. Unless we have animals or children or something. Or the other humans may move about. In most homes, there's very little life. And the less life there is, the less ambiguity there is, the less of a prediction burden there is. Now, of course, there's an array of trenchant ironies here, because no ambiguity means no opportunity, no adventure, no development. Essentially a kind of living death. It's very safe, but nothing happens. David Byrne, I think, once said, heaven is a place where nothing ever happens, or rather he sang this. It's very insightful. He was aware, whether conceptually or not is a question, in the same way I am, but he was aware of this interplay of vigilance, ambiguity, and prediction. And so intelligence might then be also a way of balancing these three potentials for maximum opportunity, minimized but not minimal ambiguity, and efficacious prediction. That last thing turns out to be really important, because if you don't see the repercussions, or if you don't care about them, of the development of techne, your children will be tormented, tortured, if there's even a world on which they might exist anymore. So there's a super dangerous array of problems that arise from either the failure to predict intelligently, insightfully, effectively, or, worse still, the disposition that inclines us to see catastrophes emergent from techne as opportunities for profit or business, which is a common malignant, cancerous disease in our present cultures. Those who hold the reins of wealth and power are well protected from almost all of the repercussions of lethally enacted techne, and can bubble themselves up inside a broad array of shields that keep them and their families relatively safe, as long as the whole damn context doesn't collapse, right? Apocalypse. And any catastrophe that costs life or health is just another way to make money. More money. Which is another way to get more power. So this leads to a kind of absolute corruption of principles. And particularly the principle of an intelligent democracy, which is the principle that our country, the United States, counterfeits. Because what we really have here is like, I don't know exactly what the right term is, but one that I use frequently lately is kleptocracy, which is just steal everything you can under the guise of a semi-democratic array of processes that have been thoroughly compromised from within, re-compromised, and continue to to find to invent new modes of the counterfeit expression of. Right? So it's like a recursively self-recounterfeiting opposite of what anything resembling an actual democracy might be, which is also something that Ammon Hillman was interested in and concerned about. I don't know why, but I found him to be one of the most entertaining of the intellects, masculine intellects I've ever encountered. Clearly a genius, also partly mad, and in some ways more like a human drug than most of the people that I've ever seen. And one of the things that he was talking very clearly about was the necessity of learning a very complex ancient language for him, this is Greek, and has excellent defenses for why. I think that he actually believes, I'm not sure about this because he says he's not religious and he says he's too lazy to be religious, which is interesting. But he does seem to believe that there is something that resembles the idea of the logos, which is, at least in my mind, a being, a metaphysical entity that is the origin of the possibility of rationality. But he used a different word. He didn't say rationality. The word that he used, though, implied the potential of making sense of things and possibly of representing them and making sense of the representations. What was the word? I can't recall it. It wasn't our word. Now, obviously, Ammon is very brilliant and has a direct relationship with something like the origins of language in humans, whether or not he conceives of it as a being. I conceive of it as an intelligence or an array of intelligences that exist outside of time and don't require a physical substrate for their existence. And the collection of these could be understood as a being. But this is all very Darwinian. I'm not trying to convince anyone to adopt my perspective here. Though what Ammon's talking about is a transcendental reunion through the careful study of what he conceives of as a cygenic linguistic substrate, which for him is Greek, and which it makes perfect sense to me why he has chosen Greek, and why he thinks it is either the ultimate or penultimate language one can study, though his experience of other languages is not particularly broad. Because the study of Greek transformed his mind in such a way that language became his companion and he rose above it so that, unlike us, rather than being subject to language, language becomes his laboratory and toolbox. He asked Danny Jones whether or not Danny coins terms. This is a crucial question. Now, on the one hand, the irresponsible profusion of self-coined terms is unhelpful at best and ridiculous at worst. On the other hand, the ongoing failure to coin terms is a sign of linguistic disability, crippling. And he was talking about the propensity of Greek to not merely allow the constant and common coining of terms, but to encourage and reward it, though I'm paraphrasing. It strikes me that the structure of German, about which I know very little, but seems to be oriented toward complex coining of terms, has a similar functionality. Right? There's lots of little parts. You can weave them together in all kinds of new or interesting or useful ways. And English also has this ability. I fairly regularly coin terms. My recent Facebook friend, Siobhan Gordon, who's a memestress who calls herself the Queen of Dreams on her memes, she recently had a reel with a picture of her hair where she basically looked like a Medusa. Her hair was so possibly intentionally distressed, probably by wind, and I referred to that as a hairpocalypse. This is an example of, coining words in English. However, you can see that in this particular coining, Greek is involved. Right? Probably many of the roots that we, the phonemes or the fragments of words that are woven together to form English terms are Greek. Some of them are Latin. Probably most of them are Greek, and some are borrowed from later languages. Sorry. Yeah, someone's injured. Spruce is injured. And when I began this walk and talk, my initial goal was to talk about the vast library of accessible intelligences that most of us will never taste. We see much more today because of two things, right? The ability to fake, to present the appearance of superhuman activity or skill, and the ability to practice and transmit superhuman ability and skill because of YouTube, particularly. I guess TikTok now as well. Lots of contagions are mixed in there. It doesn't just transmit intelligence or training or skillfulness. But by constantly exemplifying what looks to us to be superhuman abilities and skills, I'm thinking particularly of parkour, certain martial arts skills, musical skills, dancing skills, skills of acrobatics or physicality, conceptual or perspectival skills, which are a bit more rare. There's this vast library of exemplars of this in YouTube and now perhaps TikTok. And this at least potentially makes them contagious. But what I want to actually point out is that these skills are not superhuman. The broad library of intelligences and abilities that we bring to our human birth are mostly inhibited, shut down, punished, or commodified, like filtered into representations, such as sports, or war. And so most of the intelligences and abilities that we might naturally embody and enact and experience together with and for each other are amputated, inhibited, or reframed into forms that can be commoditized and thus controlled, bought and sold for purposes that aren't actually human, but serve what it's not Vervaeke, what Oglen, I can't remember this guy's actual name, refers to as the replicators, which are a branch. It's his concept for the bad human collectives that just keep doing terrifying things and converting, vast populations of humans to robots and slaves and things. So most of us don't actually understand that there's a kind of a link-up that can occur between the mundane physicality of our human common experience and expectation and what we might imagine as the transcendent and or the divine. Ammon Hillman speaks of the muses. This is a very familiar concept to me, and it's not familiar in the basic conceptual way that it might be familiar to academics. No, it's familiar to me in the way of the difference between someone who has only ever heard about the existence of vast bodies of water and someone who has jumped into them and swam in them, like the difference between someone who's only heard of a lake and someone who has solo dived in the ocean. This kind of familiarity. There are forces, intelligences, beings in the universe that correspond to the concept of the muses. The Greeks might appear conceptually insane or hyper-religious to us moderns. The actual problem is the other way around. We are idiots about the transcendental, us moderns, generally speaking. We either refuse to acknowledge that it's possible or real, or we form bizarre, insane representations, which we then subject ourselves and others to in the form of organized religion. Not that all organized religions are bad, wrong, etc., but the vast majority of them are crippling because the feral intensity of our actual human nature and intelligences exceeds the entire payload of all human spiritual traditions. by many orders of magnitude, and this is what I'm trying to talk about today.
So, there were some times
That potential that we bring to our human birth, and the possibility of recovering our capacity to understand and pursue those intelligences, the development and enaction of those intelligences together with and for each other, with and for the history of future and future of life on Earth, with and for the benefit of all beings in all of time. This is an imperative I trust, and there aren't too many that I trust that way. So, you see examples of humans doing things that look impossible to us. I don't know, playing 47 notes per, more than a note per second on the guitar, for example, which isn't necessarily genius and can be stupid, because beauty and speed are not the same thing. Hyperfunction isn't the same thing as prodigy, but there's a relationship there that's real. You can see wild examples of people climbing up walls, flipping over in the air, doing all kinds of seemingly impossible monkey-like acrobatics under the rubric of parkour. You can see someone shatter a stack of bricks not with a punch, but with a movement of their fingertips that's less than an inch. Right? They have no time in which to accelerate. They go from 0 to pure acceleration in a span of less than an inch. All kinds of profound martial examples of martial skill and effectiveness, some of which are phony, right? For sure, some of that's phony, but a lot of it isn't. Plenty of it isn't, right? The capacity for not merely superfunction in our bodies and minds, but hyperfunction is real and natural to humans. It's not superhuman. It's human. Or it's subhuman in the sense that it arises from either our animalian basis, our organismal basis, our basis as organisms, or our basis as beings, right? And if we imagine those as sort of rings on a cone, that the top of which is the human, then these are subhuman features. And if we imagine them as rings, that the lowest point of the cone, right, whether the cone goes up or down, as the lowest point as human, then they are more than merely human, which I would argue they are. The ladder rung of our being is more than the ladder rung of our organismal nature, which is more than the ladder rung of our animalian nature, more than the rung of our human nature. But it's useful to be able to think in either direction about this, and to not be too biased, because are they actually separate rungs? Right? There's lots of important questions here. But the thing that I want you to understand is that you came to human birth, and every person that you ever loved and that you ever knew, they came to incarnation endowed with an anciently developed library of seemingly impossible faculties and abilities that mostly get amputated, circumcised, lost, lied about, faked. There's lots of people who think, psychism is impossible. Darren Brown proved that. Because Darren Brown can fake the feats of mentalists and psychics, his presumption is that because I can fake those, all such things are fake. That's not true, and it's not possible. Telepathy is real. Mind-to-mind contact is real. Mind-to-place contact is real. Mind-to-time contact is real. The ideas that we consider to be our sober defenses against superstition and fakery are just as dangerous as they are protective if they blind us to the veritable existence of anything that can be counterfeited. And Darren Brown is a professional counterfeiter. So, not surprising. I mean, he has a grudge, right? And his grudge is purposeful and intelligent to a degree. It's just that the degree is not universal. He doesn't want people to be taken advantage of, lied to, shriven of their money, time, belief. So he wants to show them that the entire domain of metaphysical and or even physical skills, he goes to a martial art dojo where the teacher is supposed to be capable of demonstrating what is called the 1-inch punch, which I spoke of earlier. And Darren demonstrates something very similar in effect. But what Darren is doing, Darren Brown that is not demonstrating martial skill. Darren has very little, if any, martial skill. Darren's skill is a skill at manipulating consciousness of nearby humans. And he's an expert at that. And so what he's actually doing is more or less hypnotic rather than physical. But let me be very clear about this. If a skilled martial artist who could execute this maneuver struck you, in the sternum with such a blow, it'd probably shatter your rib cage. Shatter it, not just break your rib. Humans have abilities. We're living in the lowest possible rung of the ladders that we were born to climb together for each other, for our ancestors, for our progeny, for the future, for life on Earth, for our species. These are noble, heroic imperatives that we come to human birth imbued with, that are stolen, lied about, compromised, sold broken, counterfeited, and sold back to us in every ridiculously addictive form because we're dying of the pain of isolation. We're dying of having no meaningful identity or role. We're dying of loneliness while surrounded by thousands of strangers. And when I say we, I don't just mean we, I mean me. This is true of my own experience. I can sense the terrifying vacuum of meaningful human experience, identity, opportunity, adventure, relation, and so forth. Moment to moment. And it is witheringly immiserating. That's a word I coined, immiserating. this pain is the origin and source of our enslavement. And some of us endeavor to break free like birds chained to a wall.
It makes me really sad because, he was finally making a movie. Yeah. And the next step would have been like audition for, doing that.
We want not merely to fly again. We want to free the mothers, the children, the ancestors, the progeny from that fate. Even if we ourselves will not fly again, we ache for the enaction of the principles from which the concept of justice derive. And that concept is not a concept of the punishment of wrongdoers. The concept of justice is the concept of liberation and resolution of harm, institutionally conserved and reenacted forms of harm that torment beings, and particularly living beings, embodied beings. No one would punish a murderer, harm them, make them pay. I mean, this is the most ridiculous idea in the history of human thought. Make them pay. No one would do that if they could simply use the intelligence gathered from some murder to ensure that future murders didn't happen, right? To make the murder medicine from the murder that actually took place. We would never punish anyone. And if we, in punishing humans for their, quote, wrongdoing, if in doing that we guarantee the reenaction of the injustice, that is insane, malignant, wrong, horrifying, stupid, inexcusable, unjustifiably catastrophic, right? We're just going to reiterate catastrophe in waves going forward in time and generations. And this is what our idea of prisoneering accomplishes. It's a for-profit slave-making system. Run by and for the benefit of the wealthy and the replicators, as that Ogie guy is talking about. So part of intelligence is understanding these principles that I've outlined today. But the greater portion is finding ways to implement that understanding that actually accomplish liberation and that grant us the contextual support for recovery operations that we engage in together with and for each other, that reintroduce our more than merely human natures, imperatives, and abilities to our direct experience, and celebrate them and support them, recognize them, encourage them. My talk today is an attempt, it's an essay in this direction. And I hope you find it inspiring and useful, because even just by having a conversation like this one, we have begun the process I described together. It may be imperfect, it may not solve all the problems, but it calls to mind the potentials and opportunities of our humanity and our origin, our nature as living beings and as more than merely human beings. And that call is the call that our incarnation originated with, worthy of pursuit, trustworthy beyond all concepts, beyond all language, beyond all skills, a compass in a darkness that grows more tangled in our modern experience with each passing moment. And, the situation seems hopeless, but it's only hopeless if the scope is too large for us to address. The moment we shrink the scope to me and you and 2 or 3 other people, the impossible becomes the accomplished. I'm so grateful for this opportunity to learn and undergo a kind of anamnesis, unforgetting, together today. I'm so grateful to all of you who listen and participate and share this with others, which is very helpful. If you can and you wish to, make a little donation, even a one-time donation on my website, organelle.org, would be very deeply appreciated. And I look forward to learning together again very soon. Thank you for joining me. Key and lock. May your path and life, relationships, dreaming and opportunities be beautiful, rich, fulfilling, and exquisite. Bye-bye for now.